Have you ever heard of D.B. Cooper? How about the man who hijacked a plane and then parachuted out of it with 200 grand in ransom money only to never be seen again? Well, that's what we're talking about today. So, let's get into it. It was Thanksgiving, 1971, when a man by the name of Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 at Portland International Airport. At the time, Dan was 56 years old. He was described as being well-dressed, and he had a suitcase with him and a briefcase. Nothing really stood out about him, so he wasn't searched or anything like that, and apparently nothing seemed suspicious about him either. Not to the flight attendants, not to the pilots, and not to the other passengers who also boarded that day. The flight was headed from Portland to Seattle, Washington. It was supposed to be just a short hop, around 45 minutes in the air, and everything was going according to plan until roughly 9 p.m. when Dan made his way to the rear of the aircraft and dropped to his knees, pulling a small revolver out of his briefcase. In front of all the passengers and flight attendants, he announced that he had a bomb and wanted to speak to the captain. Within minutes, the captain got on the phone with Dan and learned that the demands were pretty straightforward. First, Dan wanted $200,000 in cash. Second, he wanted 4 parachutes. And third, he wanted the plane to fly to Mexico City. Dan said that he had a bomb and would detonate it if his demands weren't met. But we still don't know if he actually did have a bomb because no one ever found any evidence of explosives on the plane or anywhere else. But whatever Dan's true intentions were, the authorities decided to play along for safety reasons. The FBI was quickly notified, and within an hour the pilots were instructed to head south towards Mexico City. At the same time, a team was assembled at the airport in Mexico City to meet Dan's demands. They loaded up 4 parachutes and $200,000 in cash onto the plane and sent it back to Seattle to refuel. Then they contacted Dan through the pilot and told him that everything was ready. So the pilots got in the cockpit, passengers got back on board, and they took off for Mexico City. Dan stayed on the phone with the pilot the entire time and gave instructions on how to maneuver the plane. And honestly, it's pretty impressive that the pilot followed all these instructions. Like, think about it. You're flying a plane full of people and you get a random dude on the phone telling you to do things. Most normal person would probably panic. But the pilot didn't. He followed Dan's instructions to the letter. They flew all night long, making stops in California and Arizona to refuel. And before they knew it, the sun was coming up, and they were approaching Mexico City. When they got close enough, Dan instructed the pilot to release the 4 parachutes and the money. Then he waited, and when they were sure that the packages had been released, he finally revealed himself. He'd donned one of the parachutes and was sitting in the open doorway of the plane. As they approached the Mexican capital, Dan jumped. That's right, he literally jumped out of a plane at 10,000 feet in the sky. Now, thankfully, that part of the story is backed up by witness testimony. There were people on the ground watching the sky who saw Dan jumping from the plane. As soon as he jumped, the pilot radioed the control tower and told them what had happened. Dan had vanished into thin air. The authorities descended into chaos. They tried everything they could to locate him, but there was no sign of D.B. Cooper anywhere. We still don't know exactly where he landed, though some reports say that he likely landed in a wooded area southeast of Mexico City. Others claim that he landed in a field west of the city. After a massive search effort that involved hundreds of people and even helicopters, it was concluded that Dan had gotten away. And that was the last anyone ever saw of him. The case went cold, the investigation stalled, and eventually the FBI officially closed the case in 2016 after over 45 years. But here's the thing. We still don't know what truly happened to D.B. Cooper. Like, how does a man simply vanish after jumping out of a plane without a parachute? Well, the truth is, he may have had a parachute. I mean, that's the most obvious explanation for what happened. Dan planned the whole thing meticulously and had a parachute that allowed him to make a safe landing. There are a couple of other theories as well. Some people believe that Dan was actually a CIA operative and that he didn't die after jumping out of the plane. Instead, he was picked up by a prearranged extraction team and whisked away to safety. Makes sense to me. Dan had all the knowledge required to pull off something like this. He knew exactly what he was doing, which suggests that he was experienced and maybe even trained. Plus, the fact that he was able to evade the authorities for so long makes me think that he definitely had some special training. Now, here's another theory that some people believe. Dan may have gotten injured during the jump and managed to hide his injuries. Maybe he wasn't wearing a parachute and survived the fall somehow, but he was hurt really bad, and he hid his injuries to avoid being captured. But why he chose to jump out of the plane in the first place is still a mystery. We can't forget about the fact that Dan left behind his suitcase and his briefcase. If he had plans to flee the country, then he wouldn't have left those items behind. They contained his identification, his clothing, and most importantly, his money. Dan didn't need the ransom money if he was already a millionaire. Here's another idea that's out there, and I find it kind of ridiculous, but some people actually believe that Dan Cooper didn't exist at all. Instead, these theorists believe that Dan was actually a woman named D.B. Korn, and here's their reasoning. Back in the 1970s, there were rumors that a woman was trying to pull off a similar hijacking, except she wanted to steal the plane instead of getting away with some cash. Apparently, D.B. Korn even wrote letters to the press bragging about her plan, but nobody knows for sure if these letters were written by the hijacker or someone else. And that's the problem with this case. We simply don't have enough evidence to say definitively what happened. There are plenty of theories and ideas floating around, but we don't know the truth. All we know for sure is that Dan Cooper boarded a plane on November 24, 1971, and was never seen again. I've got to be honest, this case has some major plot holes. It doesn't make sense to me how someone could jump out of a plane at 10,000 feet without a parachute and survive. I mean, I'm no expert on parachuting or falling from planes, but that seems pretty dangerous. Like, yeah, it's possible that Dan had a parachute and made it work, but it's also possible that he was lying about having a parachute and just jumped anyway. But the biggest plot hole in this case is the fact that Dan was never seen again. Like, if he did have a parachute and successfully jumped from that plane, then where did he go? Where is he now? Someone who successfully jumps from a plane at 10,000 feet should be considered a national hero, right? Like, that's an amazing accomplishment, and yet we still don't know who he was or where he is. What do you think happened to Dan Cooper? Let me know in the comments below. I personally think he had a parachute and successfully escaped. But who knows? Maybe he was lying and just jumped anyway. Or maybe he was the woman known as D.B. Korn. There are so many questions and so few answers in this case. It's definitely one of the more interesting ones. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I've got plenty more content coming your way. But until then, stay safe out there. Peace.